webinar. The Anthony Pym's webinar lecture today is the opening lecture of the 7th edition of the European School of Literary Translation Summer School, which will run online through Friday, September 9th. This lecture is also open to an audience outside the school. The European School of Literary Translation is a spin-off of the European Union-funded Petra e-project, which worked from 2014 to 2016 to establish a common framework for the teaching and training of literary translation. The project then gave rise to the Petra e-network, a network of more than 30 European and non-European institutes involved in literary translation. The first ESLT summer school took place in Rome at Link Campus University from September 12 to 15 in 2017, and will then go online starting in 2020. The program of this 7th edition of the ESLT Summer School will bring together 25 translators and lecturers from around the world. The school is a mix of lectures, seminars, and workshops, and includes a panel discussion with leading European Translation Association. The title of this edition is Teaching Translation as an Ethical Practice. And now, and this is also the reason we have Anthony as to open the session. And now a few words to introduce Anthony Pym. Anthony Pym is one of the most important scholars in international studies, and his contribution to the field has been and is of enormous importance and influence. This means that any presentation is insufficient even to mention the contribution Anthony has made to the discipline. After all, one need only scroll through any bibliography on traditional studies to find all the works with which Pym has contributed to building the field of research. I will therefore only mention that Pym is Distinguished Professor of Translation and Cross-Cultural Communications at the Rovira i Virgili University of Tarragona in Spain, Professor of Translation Studies at the University of Melbourne, Extraordinary Professor at the University of Stellenbosch, and Honorary Professor at the University of Leicester. He also served as a President of the European Society of Translation Studies from 2010 to 2016. The title of Pym lecture is How to Translate Literature in the Superdiverse City. Anthony, thank you for accepting this invitation, and we are ready to hear from you. Thank you.
Right, many thanks, Stefano, and my thanks to the European School of Literary Translation, and further thanks to Duncan Lodge, who's collaborating in this project at the British Centre for Literary Translation. And good morning to everybody. I'm actually in Spain at the moment, so it's just past 12 o'clock, which counts as good morning in Spain, okay? I'll talk for a bit, then I'll bring in a PowerPoint later on, I think. I want to set up what I've been doing in Australia. About 7 years ago, I went back to Melbourne after 38 years outside of Australia. So I left the country that was largely Anglo. That means English speaking with a dominant English language culture. And I returned to a city that is something else entirely. Melbourne has more than 270 languages spoken at home. Okay, it's a city of 5 million people, more or less, and it therefore counts as what we call a super diverse city. It's not just a few languages vying. There are many, many, many languages at all different kinds of periods when they arrived and different socioeconomic categories within those groups. Incredibly diverse. Now, thank you, recording. Okay. For me, that's really exciting. That's what I want to work on. I really came there and said, well, how can translation help this society live together? And in COVID, that became a very big question, but that's not what I'm talking about here. The thing about multilingual, multicultural cities, such as the ones you may be in, is that they're not easy. A few numbers. 52% of the indigenous population has experienced racial prejudice in the last 6 months, 52%. 58% of speakers of languages other than English have experienced racial abuse on public transport. 56% of those speakers of languages other than English have encountered discrimination in education settings. That's what really worries me. And then globally, this is a summary that I take from an Amnesty report, 76% of Australians with a non-European background have experienced ethnic discrimination in the previous year. Okay, there's a problem there. And that, I think, is an ethical problem. It's not a problem of translation, it's not a problem of literature, it's a problem of a certain kind of society, which might be the kind of society you live in. There is intolerance and bigotry and an incredible lack of interest in cultural alterity as a positive value. Now, I happen to have worked on translation ethics and formulated an ethical aim for translation, which is to help promote long-term cooperation between cultures. But you'll see that little sentence there, help promote long-term cooperation between cultures, is not just for translation, not just for literature, it's for all communication in a multicultural setting, all communication. And my real problem here is, how can translated literature feed into that aim? How can it help rather than hinder in trying to attain that aim? Now, if I set up ethics in that way, it rigorously focuses on people first and the events in which people interact, and only then on an ethics of representation, of how well this translation represents the author's words, author's intentions, author's text function, whatever. Okay, I'm not concerned here with an ethics of fidelity or representation. I'm turning my back on the kind of discourse on translation ethics that has belonged to the book era from the early modern period, right the way through. As soon as there were books with printed pages, you could translate to be faithful to the book, or equivalent, if you like the linguistic terminology. I don't care about that, because my problem is much bigger than books. And I think the way our societies are working also goes well beyond bookish culture that we've inherited from the early modern period. Now, for that reason, I'm not noted as a literary scholar, and I'm not really a specialist in any sense in literary translation. So I'm doubly honored to be invited here today. However, I have paid my dues, and let me characterize what literature has meant to me very, very briefly, okay? When I was entering university as a rather despondent, troubled, even suicidal young man, with lots of questions about the world, I didn't enroll in literature because I didn't think I was good enough for it. And then I sort of discovered, hey, I am good enough, I think, I know how to read. Anyway, I moved towards literature because it was the only field of study that was addressing the big questions that concerned me. And it offered a form of transcendence. And transcendence is the word I want to use here, and it's the ethics that I want to question. Transcendence, when you are in Perth, Western Australia, with the Indian Ocean out there and a lot of desert out there, transcendence just means help get me out of here, beam me up, literature, move me out of here. It helped as well with a certain social mobility, but it also offered a wider world to which one could have access, and a form of communication that could extend beyond mortality, beyond generations, and beyond countries. Transcendence in that sense. What did I do? I studied comparative literature in my undergrad. I did a PhD in Paris on the sociology of literature. I wrote my doctoral thesis in a year at the comparative literature department at Harvard University, and I did a postdoc in Göttingen in Germany in a Sonderforschungsbereich, a special research center in literary translation. So, hey, I've paid my dues. I've done my literary bit. But then I lost the faith. I was no longer seduced by that appeal to transcendence, if you will. And why was that? For some years, I was doing the day-to-day running of a cultural foundation, a French-Spanish cultural foundation, in which we gave grants to writers in residence and to painters, actually. And we had conferences on literary topics. And I came to see the people around me there as basically school teachers who were third-raters, living the dream, aspiring to something that they would never get to. And I saw myself as one of them as well. That appeal of the transcendent literary sphere no longer worked for me. Georges Mounin actually calculated that. He said, if you think that you're going to get your novel published, good luck. And if you think it's going to be in print in 30 or 50 years' time, you're better off buying a lottery ticket as your ticket to paradise. The chances are so slim. That promise of transcendence is so small that you better get a lottery ticket. And yet, the appeal to transcendence remains strong, especially among literary translators who use it as a way of being close to the great author or to study in detail the great text. And indeed, in the evaluation of great literary text, translated into so many languages, moving beyond one language into other languages as a measure of their transcendent power. I think that there's a lot invested, a lot of power in that kind of literature that, for me, to do what I want to do, I have to turn my back on. I think I have to go and think a different way about literature and try to do something different with it. And that concerns what one does with literature in a city, but also, given today's topic, how one trains people in literary translation. So my question is, can you see literature? And then, if you can you see literary translations? That's Melbourne. That's a map of the languages. There are lots more colors if you go into it in detail. You can't see much except that there's a lot of Chinese around that part there and quite a bit out here, but there are many other languages as well. You'd have to zoom in to see where literature is functioning. Now, I recall going to a seminar when I was a student in Paris, a doctoral student, and the seminar leader, Jacques Lénard, was actually doing research on literary reception, reading. And he began the seminar by saying this, that literature is one of the ways in which a society speaks with itself. I was sitting at the back, as I used to do, and I said, please, sir. No, I didn't say please, sir, Monsieur Lénard. I've just come here in the metro, and I noticed that people were reading books so as not to talk with each other, that they are each entering their little network of communication with the people they choose to communicate with, but trying to avoid the people that they are actually living with in the city. So I'm not too sure if that is what literature is doing or should do. Of course, my observation came from Walter Benjamin on Baudelaire and Le Flâneur. When breaking away from agricultural society, we get urbanization and transport within the urban environment, where people of different social categories, different professions, are forced to be alongside each other and necessarily don't know each other and distrust each other. So there's a whole literature of character analysis and how to tell whom you can trust, how to phrenology, read the bumps on their heads and then figure out if they're likely to be a criminal. Okay, so that all that happened with urbanization, and the role of literature in the urban environment may indeed be quite the opposite, may be to separate people. And if that's the case, then I'm not going very well with my question. Now, I enjoyed reading work by Mohsin Kafi. Okay, this is a doctoral thesis, and then the chapter, if it has been published. It's a study of translated literature in Wellington. Wellington is in New Zealand. It's the capital of New Zealand. It's not a very big place, so it's a good place to do a case study and see where literature is in the city. Now, Kafi finds, obviously, translations are in bookshops still exist in Wellington, by the way. They also exist in Melbourne. There are translations there. They are actually quite numerous, albeit on the back shelves. Okay, you have to go and look for them. Wellington is a capital city, so it has foreign embassies. Those embassies organize cultural events to promote their culture, and translated literature is very much present at those events, because each culture wants to see its prize authors, its national transcendence manifested in English. And about 20% of the population speaks languages other than English. So there's a certain readership for translated and non-translated literature around there as well. And Kafi goes in and talks about the Writers' Week, which happens every 2 years in Wellington, when they bring in writers from the outside, and translators are sometimes used for them. So I just pick up that blueprint and look around Melbourne and see what I can find. Melbourne is quite a bit bigger, so there's a lot more of everything, basically. There are a lot more events, and the Melbourne Writers' Festival happens every year, and it's a very big thing, and I've actually been participating in it in recent years. A few years ago, we did a translation workshop on a Chinese novel, which then went on to radio, and we had some write-ups in the press and things. And then more recently, I've been working as an interpreter. Now, lots of people come to these events. We bring in some writers of note from outside, and we discuss topics that are concerned not just about literature, but of wider social issues. And that festival has repercussions, obviously, in radio and on television. Okay, the international writers will be on television talk shows and discussions. Okay, so there's quite a lot of movement around translated literature because of these events. And I invite you to find out what happens with translated literature in the place you happen to be. Now, that doesn't help us understand what the role of the translator is in those particular spaces around the city, or what it should be. We could look for a certain translatorial visibility in language choices, Venuti with his marked prepositions, for example. We could look for an even more visible mediator in the idea that the translator is presenting their reading of the text, and so they are an important part of the presentation. This idea is in Venuti and picked up most usefully in the translations and media events of Susan Bonofsky in the United States. The claim is, I'm not translating the text or the author, I am translating my reading of the author, which, if you think about it, is a claim to infallibility. Bonofsky and the Pope are both infallible. But more terre-à-terre, more mundane, are the kinds of visibility that do happen around the city. For example, story time, an event at the State Library, also online, and we've got a bilingual presentation of children's stories. Okay, and people come to it or go do it online. This is easy to set up. It probably has more social impact than any of the grand American theories that we have over there of visibility. I think, though, that visibility in itself is not enough. I think that we have to create a certain passion, and that passion is called admirazio. This comes from Descartes. Descartes, the passions of the soul. Descartes observes that most passions have their opposites. Love is the opposite of hate, good and evil, etc. Except for the first passion, says Descartes, which is admiratio. And admiratio is when there's an object and you say, oh, what is it? You don't know if it's good or bad for you, but you know it's there and you want to find out more about it. And that's the hardest thing. It's creating or grabbing attention, if you like. If you wanted to give a contemporary translation of admiratio, it might be attention grabbing or stickiness, as one says about websites and such. How do you create admiratio? By creating an event on many levels in many media. And how can you do that as a translator? I want to use an example that is pretty famous, and I hope you've heard about it already. If not, I'll tell you. Behrouz Boochani wrote this novel, No Friend But the Mountains. Now, Boochani came towards Australia by boat through Indonesia, a perilous trip, and was then detained, as would-be immigrants tend to be, is an asylum seeker from Iran, and was put in a detention center, which is an island off Australia. The Australian policy is you will not get to Australia, you will go to an island. This is how the UK got its idea about sending people to, where is it? I don't know, to Rwanda. Yeah, right, okay. Oh, we've got these islands in Australia, which is little more than a prison and a long-term prison in this particular case. Now, Boochani wrote the novel in WhatsApp and sent it out via WhatsApp to this guy over here, Omid Tofigian. I'm not good on pronunciations of Iranians, okay? Who translated the text in collaboration with the author, and it's a very interesting process going on there, but then got it published, and not only got it published, but promoted it, and promoted it to the extent that it won the Victorian Prize for Literature. Now, this became an event, not only because of the remarkable qualities of the text, which are indeed there, but also because the rules of the prize said that the author has to be an Australian citizen. This person is not an Australian citizen. So the committee made him one for the purpose of the prize. And that kind of event takes on extreme ethical qualities when it exposes the absolutely absurd immigration policies of the country and counters them publicly and points attention to a book that people can pick up and read and be moved to act upon and vote upon. Admiratio, the event. The role here of the translator is not just to pick up the WhatsApp messages, piece them together, discuss it with the author, market the book, and go up and accept the prize and become the spokesperson for the author. There's also an account of how he wrote the translation in conjunction with the author there, if you want to chase it up. Now, some of what I'm talking about there is happening in literary translation classes. People are trained how to contact publishers, how to draw up a translation project, how to promote it, okay? Now, I want to do more of that in the translation class, more of it, not just presenting a translation project to publishers, but why not go from a book to a video, to a promotional video, and put it out there and see what kind of admirazio that can attract. In the last week of my undergraduate courses at the moment, we have a 90-minute activity where groups with the different languages, I work in multilingual translation classes, that is language neutral with different languages, they have to develop a video based on a poem and present it, and then the others decide which one they like most, okay? And they become incredibly good at doing that. For the projects, the video projects, we have some groups are the companies, are the publishers, and the publishers have to decide which of these projects they're going to go with. The publishers, the clients, if you like, are the ones who learn the most about what promotion means and what works. The promotions are audiovisual, written, but spoken. It's a pitch, and we train people how to do a decent pitch as well. You can therefore work from print to audiovisual, which is what we do. But you know what? Publishers are bastards. It's hard to get published. It's hard to get it into a book and send it around the world. Why not just put it out as a podcast? Make it a voice that's exciting and interesting to read, and younger generations love podcasts. They'll be running around, riding their bikes, listening to your translation of the novel for free. Well, it might do some good. You might get some impact. You might get some admirazio. Don't forget the voice. And then if you can use the voice on the output, why not remember the voice on the input? Some of the most harrowing stories that I've encountered in the past 7 years have been of immigrants, not just recent, but also historical immigrants, recounting what they escaped, how they got there. God. And you think, well, you know, this is literature in itself, these stories. What you can do is pick them up and put them into whatever language you think is going to have most impact, and give them form and give them literary value and distribute them. And this has got to create some kind of awareness of what, of why you need a multicultural society as a refuge from the evils of the wider world. Let me go on. A lot of what I'm talking about here doesn't concern how you produce translations. It's how you market them, how you get people interested in them. So it's instructive to get students, not just you, but students, to go in and check out what happens with readers' comments about translations on Amazon, on Goodreads, and see how those translations are working and which ones people prefer and why. More than that, you can oblige whatever class activity, get them to participate in the threads and see if they can get discussions going. Now, in this, I'm really thinking about the way audiovisual communication is working online, in drama that people consume online and use lots of comments, lots of timed comments. And for some of the Chinese, Japanese stuff, you got these danmaku comments that fly across the screen. And you got very, very rich discussions around the actual text. The paratext takes on a very vital, multicultural, multilingual role, especially the stuff in Chinese, where sometimes you've got machine translation being used. It makes mistakes. People who know Chinese come in and correct it, and there's a discussion about that, and you get this multi-layered translatorial discourse, in a way triggered because machine translation has been used in a way that would not happen if you had the authoritative human translation that puts an end to discussion. Book clubs are alive and well in Australia. I don't know where you are, but book clubs are the way the middle class tends to consume literature. It's an excuse to have some gossip and some wine. Let people go out and find out about what books are in book clubs, and if they use translations, how do they decide on the translation? Get them to participate in book clubs and see what happens there, okay? There's a lot more there to be explored, and I really use the space of the classroom, the multilingual classroom, where I have people from these communities to go out and find out what's happening with translations around them. Part of that is historical. This has to do with my own research at the moment, but I put it here anyway. It's to translate texts that are not from a foreign country, from the deep dark past or this transcendent other world. Look at translation as something that has happened in the place you are. So this Poison of Polygamy is actually the first Chinese novel in Australia, written in Chinese, just a few kilometers from the university in Melbourne. That has been translated into English with the Chinese and the English, with a lot of notes and a lot of long introduction, lots of explanation. Great piece of work, recuperating that multilingual past of the city, and that has been turned into a stage play as well, just emphasizing the multimedia kind of work that can be done. My own work is going back and looking at historical translators. These are Indigenous informants for a missionary in the centre of Australia. This is actually a letter of safe passage carried by one Udin, was a Sri Lankan who worked with Indonesian Malay, Bahasa, in the north of Australia. And this was for sea pirates. It was from the Malay, written in Arabic, as was the custom at the time. And Udin's job, later called John O'Dean, was to carry around this letter and ward off the pirates for the voyages of discovery in the north. Okay, I pick up Udin because he's actually one who has been worked on by the Sri Lankan community in Australia as evidence that they too contributed to the history of the place, as indeed did the Chinese through the gold rush years, especially. That Australia was an incredibly multilingual country before it became that boring Anglo-Irish 20th century void. In the translation class, you can get people to work into a language, okay, but you can also ask them who speaks that language and who's going to be reading the translation or listening to it or watching it, and who isn't. Who are the excluded? Who are the people who don't engage in this? And sometimes that can give rise to new forms of translation. Now, I'm from Perth. The Aboriginal language there is Noongar. Noongar was as good as dead, but it's being brought back to life. And what does one do with translation to revitalize a language? Of course, you translate Shakespeare into Noongar. Great. It's a great language. We can handle transcendent literature. Yeah, why not? Who's going to read Shakespeare in Noongar? The kids aren't. But put Fist of Fury into Noongar. And they will. They'll watch that and they'll go around doing their kung fu and they'll speak their Noongar words when they're doing their kung fu. They might even learn to like their language and learn their language, or the language that their parents and grandparents were trained to forget. Here is Bruce Lee in Noongar, ladies and gentlemen. Right. Do something different. Think about it laterally. Think about the alternatives. Think about the people who are not being reached and get them engaged in a multicultural situation. It might seem difficult to do, but it just takes a bit of discovery and a lot of creativity. And if you think it's impossible, consider just for a moment MasterChef, if you have MasterChef in your country. Australian MasterChef was recommended to me by friends in South Africa. Say, South Africa, why are you watching MasterChef from Australia? And they say, it's got all the cuisines. More popular in India than the Indian version. Same reason. MasterChef brings together people who are mediators, who are translators, who are translating stuff that their parents and grandparents and their culture have done and putting it into a dish, which is then sampled. It exists on television, it's streamed, it's in the cookbooks, it's talked about, it has a multimedia impact. You can consider these people translators and their reception as being intercultural, because there are nevertheless the judges who are also non-Anglo as a rule. And then everybody who watches can participate by trying to cook the dish, or if not, by talking to people about it, or talking with the person on the bus or the train or the neighbor down the road, or the other mum when you take your kid to kindergarten, or your fellow students at the university. It's not hard, I think, to get a cultural product operating across languages that can involve people in communication, that can work against that bigotry and hatred and pure racism that does exist. Can literature help in that? I hope so, and I invite you to discover even further ways in which that can be done. Thank you very much. Stefano, are you there?
Okay, yes, here I am. Okay, thank you, Anthony, for your wonderful speech. And we are now open to question and answers. We have more or less, I think, 25 minutes for questions and answers. So please, you can use the question and answers button and also the chat button for put questions, and Anthony can read the two possibilities. So please enter with your questions.
No questions. It was definitive, obviously.
You have one question.
The Q&A. Okay, sorry.
Do you see it?
Merita Paul van Voorde. When you say from print to podcast, do you mean make an audiobook and turn it into a podcast? Yes, or anything else, because Merita, you're going to be younger than me, so you're going to be better at it than me, all right? But I know at my university in Australia, we have a specialist in podcasts, so we are producing high quality podcasts, and they're tremendously successful. Oh, Brigitte, oh, there you go, from Melbourne. I've got Stefano, do you want to mediate this? Because I'm going to get lost in all the messages here. Or shall we just go with?
I can, okay, I can read some question. Marisha Gupta, how to bring back past translated books onto bookshelves again?
Okay, I don't know. I mean, publishing is such an exploitative industry and unnecessary these days. You know, why not bring them back into podcasts and in YouTube videos and get people, I don't know, circulating PDFs on the web? Bookshelves are hard. People don't go to bookshelves that much. They do in some places in Melbourne, but in many places they don't. So if you can do it, great, go for it. But if you find it too hard, you know what? There are alternatives these days. Brigitte is a colleague in Melbourne. The PMLA out. No, I've circulated for the members of the school here. I circulated a short text that will come out in PMLA, Publications of the Modern Language Association of America, later this year. Okay, so it's coming soon, but it just goes through a list of suggested activities similar to the ones I've just presented here. I'm sure everybody's younger than me these days. Okay.
Okay, other questions?
Which are lying in anthologies.
Yeah,
hey, you see all these books behind me? They're dead. People are not reading them. That's why they're here. This is translation studies, you know, anthologies, things like that.
And look at, Anthony, do you see the other questions? Christina Arens.
You mentioned looking at reviews of translations and translation costs. Do you find many reviews, especially dealing with translation? If you need tips on how to find them. Yeah, look, reviews do not pay attention. They are searchable on Goodreads. Goodreads has a lot, and I have a doctoral student who's just finishing up now. He's looking at translations of Siddhartha. You know, Hermann Hesse. If we had long hair and we were hippies, we all read Siddhartha. If not, doesn't matter. But yeah, you do a search for translation or version or any of the word translator, and you can bring out the ones that do talk about translation. There's an article, there are a couple of articles doing that, one led by Heidi Kotzer, who will be in this school later this week, and others on Chinese classics. So some research has been done using that material, but people can do it as well. Just use the search tool. Okay. And yeah, it's interesting, Christina. We found for Siddhartha that the algorithms bring people back to the one translation. So even if they think they're buying a different one, they tend to come back to the one classic translation. So the discussion is curtailed by commercial algorithms, and we will publish something on that. Stacy, ethical access concerns about translating stories from communities such as refugees. I don't know, but you would hope you would get permission from anybody if you're using their life story.
There is also some question in the chat, Anthony. I try to read someone.
Okay.
Matilde Soliani, thank you for this inspiring speech. I have two questions. Are you referring to a specific theoretical framework when speaking of superdiversity? Vertovec, Van Wamert, or others? Also, which cities in Europe would you consider as the most interesting, suitable to investigate literature translation in superdiversity? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly Blomert is the definition and the concepts that I'm following, and he shared this fascination with the cities in Antwerp and Brussels. Which city? I think the cities where you are. I think there's an important thing that the researcher should belong to the place as well. Should be discovering the places that we're in. I'm not suggesting you should move somewhere else just to find super diversity, but you can do that. Barcelona is a great place, for example. Although what happened, we have a project at the moment that compares Barcelona and Brussels for COVID communication. But obviously, both those places are obsessed with their national languages, Catalan and Spanish, and then Dutch and French, and tend not to be aware of the numerous other languages that are around them. So there's a lot of awareness-raising work to be done in those kinds of places as well.
Marcus, in the Q&A, thanks for your introduction. I recognize some of the issues in the area of the outreach in the performing arts. Do you as well? Yeah, sure. There's a lot to be done there in the crossovers. I think we've been hung up on the written book for far too long. And it's just enough to look at what's actually done with texts and the different ways they can be transformed. Some of us have to get over a restrictive definition of translation in that sense. Okay. And also, Pierre Fougère, do you think that translation ethics as an event can be studied post-phenomenologically? I am working with Hélène Badiou's theory of the event and combining that to ethical insights gleaned from your own work. Yeah, Pierre, that's a really good question, and it worries me. Okay. So I'm arguing here for events as creating Admirazio and bringing people together and getting discussions going. All right, that's okay. Leading to cooperation. But the Nuremberg rallies of Hitler's Nazi party were also events. And if you go to Badiou, you can see that his engagement with left-wing politics
would accept that you don't need any proof. His work on Paul, my grace is enough for you. I think there's a danger there, and I just want to signal the danger. There must be something somewhere along the way. A Trump rally is just as dangerous as a Hitler Nuremberg rally, and they are events, and yes, they can be very successful. So please share my concern, Professor.
And
the literary translator in general, it depends very much where you are, what you're doing, who you're doing it for, what your aim is. I particularly want people who are going to take risks, risks going in multimedia, who are going to do things that will capture attention. A lot of the translations that I've been analyzing indicate to me that translators generally tend to be risk averse. And this is what we learn from the study of translation tendencies, also known as universals, that translators like to explain things, make them easier, not use hard words, etc. I want translators to attract attention by producing exciting texts. So there are two things. There's what translators might be in general, and what I think they could or should do to achieve the aims that I've outlined.
There is there are other questions in a Q&A and in the chat also. In the chat, how can literary translators, immigrants, prove themselves as translator in a multilingual society to do translation for a specific spatial community?
Well, start where you are. Start by looking at the communication channels. When we were analyzing COVID, or specifically vaccination communication, which is what I've been looking at, we found that different communities have different ways of moving around. So, it's WhatsApp for some, Facebook for others. It's website communication for a few, but not for many, to tell the truth. And then the communication that was most effective was a doctor getting up and talking in the first person about why he or she had their family vaccinated. Makes you think. What counts is the trusted mediator more than when the actual information comes from, and then getting into the medium that is appropriate to the community. Now, that can go along with a book. There's no reason why one medium should exclude any other. You have content, you can try and market it in many different ways. See what works, see who picks it up, see who calls you back, see who sends you an email, invites you to do an interview on the radio. Community radio should not be forgotten either. It can be very important.
In the chat still, considering your examples, could we say that the city translation as a niche subdiscipline defines the thresholds of translation as a broad semiotic concept rather than a translation studies-based concept based on language?
Yes. And the answer is yes. Yes. I mean, look, I still think language is incredibly powerful. And I still am looking here at language, going from one language to another. But one can also go from one medium to another, as well as the one language to the other. I personally don't want to get rid of language because it's such a powerful social tool. And maintaining a multilingual city is one of the great challenges. I mean, I want people to cooperate as best they can in their communities and tolerate each other. But the bigger challenge is to have this wonderful creation continue generation after generation with the languages being learnt, with a multilingual community. And for that reason, I do, in my own work, still privilege language-to-language translation, as well as all the other semiotic stuff that's built on top of it.
Two questions in Q&A. Ruth Martin, in Melbourne, do the students in the translation classroom reflect the diversity of the city?
No, they're rich because they're smart. Not all, by the way. Huh? And we struggle to get Aboriginal students in. You know, we go looking for them. So yeah,
Duncan Large, thanks so much, Anthony. I love the idea of generating Admirazio. It strikes me that Proust would claim the opposite of admiration is indifference, but that's a different discussion. But how can we persuade publishers to pay translators to do this kind of promotional work?
Good luck. Perhaps you can do that, Duncan. You got more powerful than well. It's going to happen one way or another. If the translator's doing promotional work, it will reflect in the sales, and you've got to get paid on the basis of the sales. So it's going to come back to you that way. All right. Now, the other question is when writers come out to festivals, are the publishers paying for them? Well, sometimes they do, but often not. And the festival organizers will put up the money to bring the writer out and then market that person around to television and radio. So it's a financial deal as well. So yeah, good luck with that. Just make the argument. But publishers tend to like getting money for them to go out and stand at the bookstore, the back of the show, to sell the books. Okay.
Another question.
Good question. Yeah.
Another question in the chat, if possible. I have another question. Karima Bozian. How can a translator effectively navigate the intricacies of preserving the specific features of a source literary work when transforming its textual elements into auditory voice components?
You can, no, very good question. You add a lot more to it. The voice and different voices, if you get different voices coming in, a novelistic concept, can add so much more to the mute printed word. Oh no, I used to drive an hour and a half into where I am now, and I would listen to books on tape. And I remember Salman Rushdie. I went past my village for another half hour so I could get to the end of the story. It was so good, right? Keep driving. You add a lot more to it. It's a different experience, of course, and you're going to have to make some choices about what goes in or doesn't go in. But one way of looking at it is that this is not the translation. It's one translation among many. And if this one does certain things, hopefully a reader who's really a fan will move on to the print or to audiovisual or film or whatever. I think it's a matter of breaking away from the idea of the one translation. As Goethe realized back in the day, you need a series of translations as we get to know the foreign culture and absorb or learn to negotiate its foreign elements.
Probably I forgot one question in the chat of Karima Bouzian. Thank you, Anthony. What role does the publishing industry play in shaping the final translated work, including decisions about marketing, cover design, and promotion?
Depends on the publisher, but usually they're the experts. They usually do know what they're doing. So you let them do it. They have people who are good at marketing in their field. But that's the book. I'm trying to indicate that there is more to translation than the book. And that younger people are well placed to go out and explore and play with that.
I don't know if I forgot some question, but I think more or less.
Yeah, because there's a Q&A and there's a chat, right?
Yes.
Okay. That's good. Somebody did ask about copyright. Look, you know what? Internet communication, Google, copyright is really, really a dream at the moment. It's a matter of respect. If you're taking someone's story, you ask for their permission. If you're working for government, you obey all the copyright legislation. But for a lot of what's happening in popular culture, audiovisual culture, web-based culture, copyright is very much a thing that belonged to book culture, I'm afraid. It's no longer operative.
I think there are no other
That's
questions.
good. It's lunchtime, Stefano.
It's exactly the 1 o'clock, so you are perfectly in time.
That's perfect. And I told Duncan that if we live in Spain or Italy, lunch is sacred because we eat well. Right? Okay. Let me thank everybody for the great questions. And thank you, Stefano, for moderating especially.
And thank you for your amazing speech, Anthony, as ever. Thank you very much.
Okay. A footnote, on my website, I do put the PowerPoint there. I'll do that in the next half hour. And I think there will be, this is on YouTube anyway, right? So I don't have to put up a recording.
Yes,
okay.
yes. Thank you, everyone, and have a good lunch.
See
time.
you.
See you. Thank you.